This is American Television with Mitchell Hadley. I'm Dan Schneider, and this time we're going to be talking about Rod Serling, most known for The Twilight Zone, but he had a career before and after, and we'll be talking about that as well. Rod Serling is the topic. We're going to be talking about his influence on American television. I'm joined by television critic Mitchell Hadley, as usual. Mitch, for those who don't know you, if you could give a little background about who you are.
Sure. Good to be with you again, Dan. I am a television historian and writer. I have authored 3 books, including The Electronic Mirror, which is a look at the role that classic television has played in American popular and historical culture. I also blog at the website itsabouttv.com, where I write about these things in more depth. And I have a new TV book that'll be coming out sometime next year, knock on wood, called The Descent into Hell, that talks about how classic television prophesized the world that we're living in today.
So, most people who know Rod Serling know him as the guy from The Twilight Zone, the creator of that show. But he has an interesting life before that. He lived a rather brief life, only 51 years. But what do we know about his childhood?
Well, his childhood, from what I have read, was a pretty happy one. He grew up in upstate New York. He wrote voraciously. He talked voraciously. His family said that once he got going, it was hard to shut him up. He just was so full of energy and so full of words and descriptions that it came pouring out of him. He would ask questions and answer them, not even wait for anybody else to get involved. And he could talk the entire way home on a family trip with nonstop without anybody else saying anything else. So he was a man who just was compelled to a certain extent to share. He was outgoing in school. He was interested in radio and in writing from an early age. At that point, radio would have been the medium that one would choose to write in, and so he wrote many, many scripts for radio. Some of them were done on shows that would become regionally or nationally heard. He became a staff writer for a radio station in Cincinnati. Really, for his entire life, he was a writer. That is really setting the stage, I think, for the rest of his life. Everything that happens to him subsequently could probably have been seen just in those years before the war.
Yeah, and he seems to have been sort of obsessed with his own youth and the image of that. Most famously, it evokes what is the film with James Stewart, the Christmas movie.
It's a Wonderful Life.
It's a Wonderful Life, and
Yeah.
he does that in the episode Willoughby, Train to
Yes.
Willoughby, where he's looking back to the late 20s, early 30s, and it's always interesting because his adult reality is the youthful, wistful stuff that someone my age would be looking back towards, and it begs the question. We know that he served in World War II, and he had what would now be called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, then called battle fatigue, known as shell shock before that even. But it seems that there must have been something in his youth that caused this yearning backward. Do you know if he ever expressed what that was? Was there an incident, good or bad, that caused this? Because everything he wrote seems to have been suffused in this desire to return.
Mm-hmm. His writing is often autobiographical. Even stories that are not explicitly autobiographical will often have some moment in them that is drawn from his own life. There is an episode of Twilight Zone where a character becomes trapped inside a phone booth. And it's because he's trying to push the doors out instead of in. For anybody who doesn't know, there used to be these things called phone booths, and they were little glass enclosures out in public areas where you could go in and use a telephone and make a call. And the doors, once you were inside the booth, these folding doors, you had to pull on them to pull in to get out. And the character is trapped in there because they're trying to push out instead of pull in. Well, Serling relates that that was based on something that had happened to him. And he experienced a mild moment of panic in the process before he got a hold of himself and realized what he had to do. But what this points out is that even in those stories that aren't explicitly based on his own life experiences, particularly the war, but not exclusively, even when he's not being that autobiographical, he is always drawing on experiences of his life. He had to have been somebody who noticed many things about life. And he experienced many things. He was a boxer when he was in the service. He did a little bit of acting when he was working in radio. More to your point, I'm not aware of any singular event that happened in his adolescence, but I do know that his memories of growing up in Binghamton, particularly in New York, were always good, and or generally good, as we would read about it. And one of the cautions he always expresses in these shows where people do go back in time and revisit their old lives, one of the cautions he always has in these is it's all right to visit the past, but don't try to live in it. You can't go home again. You can relive certain parts of it, but you can't stay there permanently. And there are marvelous moments when his characters talk about that, when a man sees his younger self and his father, who has figured out that this stranger is actually his son from the future, tells him, you've already had your childhood, let him have his, talking about his younger self. And so Serling was always keenly aware of that you had to be very careful when you went back into the past, that you couldn't get lost in it, that you couldn't become a slave to it. He was always looking forward in that sense to what was next. And I think that too is something that you see throughout his writing, this obsessive need to keep moving, to almost like a fish who has to keep moving underwater.
Yeah, with many of our people that we've done these shows on, focus more on the bio, and I will get to that in a little bit, but I want to talk a little bit more about sort of the mythos, because Rod Serling is one of those people that young kids today, if they don't even know who he was or know what the Twilight Zone was, they know if someone says something, submitted for your approval, in that very staccato like thing, they know that belongs to something, meaning that there's something weird going on when people do that. And he has to be one of the 3 or 4 most imitated people or celebrities of, at least in America, of the last 100 years. Maybe Charlie Chaplin and a couple of other people would be that way. But I wanted to talk a little bit about 2 things that are always associated with him. I mentioned the staccato voice and whatnot, but one is that he was this angry young man. He came back from World War II, and he just detested the violence.
Yes.
He detested war in general, even if
It had
you were
a
on the right
profound
side.
effect on him, yes.
And then also what we would then call Napoleon syndrome, that he was short. A lot of people always describe that he was never satisfied because he couldn't make sports teams. He couldn't. He didn't feel like he was taken seriously, even in the army. So let's talk about his reputation as being angry and out to change the world. And was that driven by his short stature?
Well, I think that yes, I think that probably played a role in it. Although I'm not sure how much of a role, but it would it would fall generally, I think, into the category of this desire to have to prove himself, and that was something that he was always trying to do. Even in the army, he had not been what you would call a particularly aggressive private. He sometimes would during a battle they'd find that while they were in this firefight he hadn't even reloaded his gun or wasn't ready to. He wasn't cut out for being a paratrooper, which is what he was. But I think that more than that, perhaps more than the short man complex, is the very nature of having been in war and been in one of the most brutal theaters in the Pacific, within the Pacific theater, when he was in the Philippines and New Guinea, and the sheer violence of what was going on there. It's strange to talk about violence when you're talking about war, but there are different kinds of warfare, and the Pacific warfare was so inhuman, that really left a huge impression on him. I'm going to say a profound impact. He came back from the war, as you said, a very angry man. He was angry about what he saw as the senseless killing. He was angry about um, the hierarchy of the military. I don't think that Serling was ever a man terribly receptive to taking orders from other people. And he said that that his writing was, to a major extent, an attempt to try to get all of that out of his system. Whether he was talking about the war specifically, and you see the war as a topic either directly or by inference in many of his scripts, even before the Twilight Zone. But whether he's talking about the war, the combat, or just the experience of being in the military, I think that that really left him with this desire to get all of this aggression and frustration and bitterness out of him. Now, I think he controlled that pretty well, but I think that the trauma inflicted on him from being in the war never left him. There was a certain physical residue of it from an injury that he had received, but when you look at so many of the plays that he wrote, not just the Twilight Zone, but other stories that he wrote as well, you see all of this conflict that's directed at the military between what you are expected to do as part of your duty and what you are compelled to do on a moral basis, and that there's often a conflict between those two values. And I think he's tried to make sense of it, to present the two sides of it in a lot of the plays that he does through this. So I don't think that there's any way to that you can overestimate the impact that had on his future.
I know my wife always comments when she loves listening to sometimes Rod Serling's college talks from the late 60s, early 70s before he died. And she's
Hmm.
always saying that I don't understand why he's always gritting his teeth and he talks now as we do. He and I think that part of the reason was the way he talked, almost through gritted teeth,
Yeah.
gave into that sort of angry young man
Well,
stereotype.
yeah, and he always strikes one as being somebody who's very tightly coiled,
Yeah.
that he could burst at a moment's notice. And probably, when he was a kid, the verbosity that we were talking about is probably just one sign of that. That there's all of this stuff, good and bad, just trying to burst its way out of him, and that he has to really hold himself in. And so I think you're right that all of these experiences, plus the way that he was given to talk in the first place, I think combine to reinforce that image with the viewer.
In the prior show that we did to this one that we recorded on Mike Wallace,
Hmm.
the newsman, we talked about his interview show, and probably one of the most famous interviews, even though considering that he was in entertainment is the interview that Wallace did with Rod Serling, and
Yes.
it's 25 minutes, I guess, only 5 minutes of commercials back then, 25 minutes long. But if you watch it on YouTube, my God, I mean, you can just feel the contempt towards corporate America that's coming
Yes.
out with how they control not only his medium but the American populace in
Yeah.
general.
Even when he's trying to be conciliatory, it comes through. And when he's trying to kind of skate over it, all he really succeeds in doing is softening it. But he's not able to prevent himself from expressing that, and he will talk about various interferences that sponsors made with programs that he had written. For instance, the famous incident where he has a scene that is set on board a British submarine, and he thought it would be reasonable for them to send up some tea to the officers, and the sponsor vetoed that line because the sponsor was a coffee maker, instant coffee. And so Serling tries to kind of downplay that. He says, well, that wasn't something that was worth going to the mat over.
Yeah.
But the very fact that he brings it up shows you that kind of contempt. And when he talks about some of his fellow writers, and we'll probably get into this more, but writers like Paddy Chayefsky, who had been at the forefront of the first generation of really great television writers, and Chayefsky chose to transition into the movies. And Wallace asks him about that by way of wondering if this is something that Serling has felt he should do, or if he feels that there's more value working in TV or whatnot. Even when he answers that question, he manages to get in a certain expression of disdain that Chayefsky was somehow kind of forced to go into the movies, where he wouldn't have to deal with some of the kinds of sponsor and network interference that you have to deal with when you're working in TV. So you're absolutely right. It's there in almost every answer to one extent or another.
Yeah, I believe he even says in that interview, or maybe it's another interview he did with someone else, but I think it's in the Wallace interview where he does say, though, that he does feel a certain kind of familiarity with television that he didn't with film. So
Yes.
as we get on to his later stuff with things like Planet of the Apes, I want to bring that up again. But let's talk about how when he got out after the war, he got into radio, much like Wallace did. What is his
Yep.
story there?
Okay, when he's getting into radio on a local level, he's working in Cincinnati at a station called WLW, which
I
is
thought you were going to say WKRP.
no. Gotcha there. WLS or WLW in Cincinnati, and so he's doing a lot of writing there. He's doing television and radio scripts. He is a big output. He says later on when he's talking about his career that he was sorry that he had become a staff writer like that because of the enormous output that was required of him, doing everything from radio programs to commercials to writing testimonials for products that he would then be doing commercials on, and the radio dramas, 5-day-a-week type dramas. And he talked about how he could have made so much more money. He could have done so much more with these if he had worked in television doing that, because what he saw radio in a way as just sucking stories out of him that he wouldn't be able to use again, or that he could have used in a better way in television. So he's in Cincinnati. Yeah, this topic comes up between he and his wife. They're talking about what he needs to do. And they decide that he's going to quit his job at the station. He's going to become a full-time freelancer. And that takes a lot of courage to do something like that. It's certainly something as a writer I wouldn't have been able to do myself. But he feels this is the only way that he's really going to succeed and make a living as a writer. So he decides to go freelance. He moves out east. First, I think he's in Connecticut. Then his agent advises him to go to New York, where the business is going to be. And so he's transitioning at that point in the late 40s from radio to television. Now, television is looking for dramatists. Television at that point is heavily involved in anthology series. New York is the center of the television world. So they're looking for new talent. They're looking for exciting writers. And it's a wonderful time if you're going to be a television writer, because you're creating an entirely new way of working. Contrast it with the movies or with Broadway, stage plays, which would be the two most predominant methods of entertainment up to that point. When you're writing for television, you are doing your craft, but you're also crafting it around commercials and for a specific period of time. So it's a completely different animal in many ways from what you're doing if you're working in another medium. And it's something that he's able to do well. He's able to understand the craft of how you write for television, how you distinguish the acts, how you are able to shape everything around the commercial pauses that are necessary in doing that kind of thing. And so he starts writing all of these scripts. He gets success with a few of them. He starts to build up a name for himself with these anthologies. And then he has what everyone would consider his breakthrough. It's a script that he writes for Kraft Television Theater called Patterns. And Patterns is a story about corporate intrigue and the balance between being ambitious and holding on to your personal ethics. And it's an overnight success, which is not exaggerating, because he and his wife didn't even stay home to watch it. You know, he told the babysitter, "Don't worry about it. You know, nobody knows we're here. You're not going to have to answer the phone." Instead, the phone's ringing off the hook. People are blown away by this drama. One of the I don't want to say seminal moments in television, but it's one of the most important dramas to that time on television. It's broadcast live, and it makes such an impact that a few weeks later, they choose to do it live again. They don't have videotape, hasn't been kinescope. They don't want to mess around with that. So they get the same crew, the same cast, and they do the whole thing live again. That's how much of an impact Patterns made. And then he goes on to adapt it to the movies, where he can let it breathe a little more. That meets with some mixed success. It was a good payday for him. But some people will say the movie was very effective. Some people would say, no, that the TV version is really, really tighter and better. So Serling has his hit. Now he's in demand. And he would go on later to say that he made a mistake he accepted almost everything, every offer that came his way. And some of it was very good, what he wrote. A lot of it, I believe he called it dreck. And the problem was he was so busy, so in demand, that he couldn't take time to polish anything. He couldn't take time to really write something of depth or intelligence. He was working on deadline, and he had to get these scripts out as quickly as he could. So there's an interesting situation that follows up from that when he's doing a radio interview. He's being interviewed by somebody who says, this is, our guest today is Rod Serling, the author of Patterns. And, well, here's Rod Serling. There was nothing to follow up on, nothing of substance. Now, that moment comes in 1956. with CBS's anthology series Playhouse 90. And it's a script he writes called Requiem for a Heavyweight. And it is, I think, the second episode of Playhouse 90. It was originally supposed to be the first, but it wasn't quite ready yet. They wanted to open up with a different story. But it's a very intense drama about an aging prize fighter who's coming to the end of his career and confronted by the fact that he doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know what his life is going to be. He doesn't know any other way of living. And everybody else has ideas for him. None of them are really acting in his best interests. And he's just a man lost. And it has a tremendous performance by Jack Palance as the fighter. And the secondary roles, his manager is played by Keenan Wynn, and another character by Keenan Wynn's father, Ed, who is known only as a comedian, had never done straight drama before, had in fact a lot of difficulty remembering his lines. And people became convinced Wynn was not going to work in this role. And Serling stood up for him, and they had someone on the set the night of the live broadcast ready to step in if he wasn't able to do it. But he turns in, he had saved everything from the bad rehearsals Wynn had and went in there and gave the performance of his lifetime. And Requiem for a Heavyweight becomes a huge event again. It establishes Serling probably at the top of the pyramid with other television writers, with Chayefsky, with Reginald Rose, with Gore Vidal. If Serling is not the best writer on television, there isn't anybody better than he is. So he has made it, and now he can afford to be a little choosier, perhaps, about his writing. And this is when we come back to something else that came from his experience in the war. After being in the war, one of the things he was determined to do with his writing was write about social issues, to write about things that are important. And in this next phase of his career, we'll see him doing that, not just dealing with the struggles inside men, as we saw in Patterns and Requiem. But now we're talking about what it means to be a man in the broader sense of how you look at yourself in society and what your moral obligations are and what kind of a life you should be living.
It's interesting. He did actually work at WKRC in Cincinnati, and I wonder if that's where they got the WKRP thing from. But
it's
anyway,
too bad they couldn't have had him in a cameo if he had been alive yet to do that.
I do have the Criterion collection that has, I think, Patterns and Requiem, and the TV versions are better. The Requiem film has Anthony Quinn instead of Palance. It's got Jackie Gleason and what's his name, the guy who was with Mickey Rooney.
Yes.
And it's good, but it's not as good. And the Patterns one is probably 15 minutes longer at least, and it's still good. But anyway, when he's doing this, he as you said, he's probably over the next 2 or 3 years has literally 80 to 100 shows on. He's in demand, and then he sort of. But even those shows, like A Town Has Turned to Dust, which later becomes an episode for Twilight Zone, they just butchered the script. It was supposed to be about Emmett Till. They moved it out to like Utah or New Mexico or something.
New England, I think it was. Set it 100 years in the past, and it's absurd. And this has another profound effect on him because he's been used to some of the studio interference, some of the sponsor interference. We talked about the T one. Another example that he pointed to in the Wallace interview didn't happen to him, but he used it as an example of what made it so difficult to work on television was the television version of Judgment at Nuremberg, where they were forced to eliminate a line in that drama about uh, gassing the Jews, putting them into the gas chambers. I think since it was a live broadcast, what they actually did when it was replayed in other parts of the country was they bleeped out the line so that you couldn't hear it. But it was because the sponsor was the gas company, or at least gas appliances. And even though there's absolutely no relationship between gas appliances and cyanide gas, the sponsor was so sensitive to it that they couldn't mention something like that. Now that's bad enough, but as he suggested, that's not the kind of interference that you might go to the mat for. The Emmett Till thing was, and just as a very brief background on that for anybody who's not familiar with it, Emmett Till was a young black man in the South who was lynched. And I think it was a crime, whistling at a white woman.
Yeah.
It was something like that. But he was lynched by a mob, and Serling wanted to do a drama about that. And it was a town. It was called A Town That's Turned to no. It was called Noon on Doomsday, and it was aired in 1956, and it was his attempt to write an allegorical telling of the Till case. He made one mistake. The mistake he made was that in a radio interview, he mentioned that it was inspired by the Till case and the racism that was involved in that.
Yeah.
And so you immediately have an uproar from both the advertisers and the network and the southern stations who are going to refuse to show it because of this. So, as you mentioned, they have to water it down. He tries to do this story twice. It is Noon on Doomsday, and then on the Twilight Zone, town is turned to dust. But he tries to do this a couple of times, and he's never able to get it the way he wanted to because of the sensitivity and the concern and something he referred to as self-censorship, where you begin to censor yourself so that you're not censored by the network or by the sponsors. Rather than battle within, you simply avoid certain issues. And he thought that was something that the industry had done to itself. That you should, and he was guilty of it as well. But he probably felt that what they should have done was stand and fight. But instead, you wanted to avoid the hassle. You wanted to avoid all the battles that you'd have to fight. You're just interested in getting your script to air. So if you have to make some changes to it, you do it. But I think this is really what is leading up to the Twilight Zone. These kinds of frustrations. He had one more script that I want to point out because I think it might have been, he had referred to this at one point as kind of the tipping point. It's a political drama called The Arena. And it takes place in the United States Senate. And there is a story to it, which is about a young man, son of a former U.S. senator, who is now a senator himself. And part of what he's coming to the Senate to do is to get even with the senator that he felt drove his own father out of politics. So he's got an animus, a grudge against this other senator. So there's a story. But there's also the typical backstory in politics. There are votes that have to be taken, issues that are discussed, lobbyists that are met with. And he found it impossible to write it because you couldn't mention tariffs, you couldn't mention foreign affairs, foreign aid, you couldn't mention any of the hot button issues because they'd be too closely identified with one party or the other. And it's a better episode than he makes it out to be, but because he talked about how the senators were reduced to talking in gibberish. Now that's a bit extreme, but it was a toothless argument. They were arguing about things you had no idea what the issue was that they were talking about, and he made the quote, and we don't know if he had the Twilight Zone in mind at that point or not, but he said after the fact, I might as well have made them robots on a foreign planet talking about these things as to what they were talking about here. It would have made more sense to have them as robots.
I think in the Wallace interview he says you can put in the mouths of Martians and Venusians what you can't put in the mouths of Republicans and Democrats.
Exactly, yes.
Well, with the Twilight Zone, as we know, it has been covered by many people many times, including us. The interview with Wallace does give the background to it. Most people do know about the twist endings. The famous second season theme song, do 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 do. So let's not spend that much time on that. But for those, do you have any just brief comments about that, and then we can talk about his lesser known post stuff with Night Gallery, The Planet of the Apes, and his career as a public speaker.
I'll just mention two very quick anecdotes about the Twilight Zone. One is that in that Wallace interview, Wallace says, and I'm paraphrasing here, can we take it that in working on the Twilight Zone, you've given up the idea of doing significant series drama? And Serling says yes, but almost immediately qualifies it by saying that he still believes he can do quality adult-oriented drama. So it's interesting that there is certainly no idea that the Twilight Zone is going to become as significant both in terms of television and socially as it does. But the reason Serling is willing to make this move toward weekly television and to become the executive producer of it, even though it means a lot of work for him, his interest is that he's hoping to be able to eliminate a lot of the battles. As the executive producer, he'll be working with the sponsors, he'll be working with the network. He doesn't have to go through other intermediaries. He's the man in charge. He's the one who picks the scripts along with his producer. He's the one who forms the stable of writers. So he's the one who's able to define the direction the show goes. And I think considering everything else that he had encountered, this was something that was very interesting to him. He knew it would be a lot of work. I don't know if it worked the way he exactly had hoped it would be, but it was a very attractive opportunity.
So after the Twilight Zone ends after a 5-year run, it has its ups and downs, but everyone is going to probably agree that even a casual viewer of it is probably going to have to admit that there's probably 20 to 30 episodes that are amongst the finest ever on American television. After this, though, he ends up doing an odd thing. He makes a Christmas movie with Peter Sellers. And it's one of those legendary things that maybe there's, I don't think it's on YouTube as far as I know the last time.
It has been. It may not be. It seems to have a propensity for being on and off of YouTube, and then it's reloaded again, and then it'll go off after a while. I've seen it. It's an interesting show. It's called Carol for Another Christmas, and it was the inaugural presentation in a series of dramas that were being done on behalf of the United Nations to show different aspects of how the UN is important in the world. And it was done with an all-star cast of stars who were either donating their services or working for scale. You mentioned Peter Sellers. I think Sterling Hayden is in it. Ben Gazzara, Steve Lawrence, whom people don't usually think of as a serious actor, but is very good in this. It is it's a retelling of A Christmas Carol, but in place of the standard story, you've got a story about the U.S. being involved in Korea or Vietnam. It doesn't matter. They are involved in an international peacekeeping mission. The central character, the Scrooge character, his son, whose picture is played by Peter Fonda, although Fonda never appears live. His picture is in it, so he does get a credit for it. His son is killed in this international action, and as a result, Grunge, that's the Ebenezer Scrooge character, Grunge has become a bitter isolationist, opposed to the UN and opposed to any U.S. involvement in foreign affairs. The three ghosts, past, present, and future, come to him trying to show what the world would be like if all countries, including the United States, took that attitude, and how the United States involvement and the UN's involvement has changed the world for the better. So it's a propaganda piece encouraging people to understand and support this role of the UN at a time when the UN was coming under great criticism in this country. It was presented without commercial interruption. It is culturally interesting to me in that it was actually aired 2 or 3 days after Christmas. Even though it's a Christmas drama, it comes from a point in time where the Christmas season actually existed, and the Christmas season ran from Christmas until just after New Year's. So you could show a Christmas show after Christmas. It also could be because it was such a grim storyline that no network in their right mind would put it on during the holiday season, when what you really wanted to do was run shows with commercials for toys. But be that as it may, it's an extremely interesting movie. It kind of has a mixed reputation. It gets a certain amount of credit just because it has Rod Serling's name on it. But if you want to look at it the other way, it's very heavy-handed. It's very one-sided. Serling, admittedly, was in something of a messianic mood when he wrote it, because he started it shortly after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. So he was in a very depressed mood to begin with. And as a result, what you've got is a lot of speech-making by characters who all sound like Rod Serling. This was a problem Serling had throughout his entire career as a writer, was that because of his workload, he could occasionally get a little lazy. And when he got lazy, his characters all tended to sound like he did.
Yeah.
So that's Carol for Another Christmas. It's not available commercially as far as I know. Turner Classics has shown it on occasion during their run of Christmas movies. Now, if you have the opportunity to see it on Turner Classics, and I've seen it there as well, be forewarned that it does not have the original soundtrack to it. Or at least it didn't when I saw it. Henry Mancini wrote the soundtrack to Carol for Another Christmas, and it's one of the works that Mancini took great pride in. And it's not on the version that was being shown on Turner Classics, nor were the original credits. And it's because we think that the version that Turner got a hold of was a version that had been sent out to various schools for showing, and so it probably was not a final cut. The final cut, which does have Mancini's music, does have the original credits, and I think does better justice to the story. That original version is what you have been able to see on YouTube when it has been on YouTube. So if it isn't on there right now and anybody's interested in seeing it, I would still encourage them to go out there periodically, or to go to Rumble or one of the other video sites out there, and you've probably got a pretty good chance, if you're patient, running it into it somewhere. Might like it, might not like it, but it's an essential part of the Serling work.
So in the late 60s, there were 3 basic projects that Serling gets involved in. And chronologically, one is a Western called The Loner. And I remember seeing 2 or 3 episodes on it when it ran, I guess when I was 4 or 5 years old. And it reminded me a lot like was it before or after Star Trek? Didn't Gene Roddenberry also do a Western?
He worked. He did some episodes of Half Gun Will Travel. He was involved with that.
There was another I think it was Roddenberry. But anyway, the loner is sort of like the fugitive in the Old West, in a sense. And we've talked about that. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, it's funny because we just finished watching The Loner this week. I've got it on DVD because it just came out a couple, 3 years ago. And Serling had mixed feelings about The Loner. He was trying to do something significant with the Western genre, to get away from the cliches that most Westerns had, and to work on something that was about the human condition, about dealing with the aftermath of violence. Lloyd Bridges, as the star, was a man similar to Serling in that he had served in and seen the horrors of the Civil War. And even though he was a
World War
West
II, you
Point,
mean?
no, in the Loner it was the Civil War.
Okay. I thought you were talking about Lloyd Bridges, not his character.
No, Bridges' character.
Yeah.
He had seen the horrors of the Civil War. Even though he was a West Point man, even though he could have had a great career in the military, he chose to step away from it because of the horrors of war and what it had taught him about mankind. And so, as he's roaming through the West, looking for something, he's not sure exactly what, but he encounters all of these characters and situations, much like what The Fugitive does. It's sort of an anthology in that way. The network was not really happy with it because they expected more action and more of a traditional Western. Now, why they would have expected anything other than what they got from Rod Serling, I don't know, because if you watch The Loner, which is pretty good actually, it's a typical Serling script. The best stories are very good. It's never less than interesting. The scripts that tend to work the least well are again the ones where everything is a speech by somebody who sounds like Rod Serling. And those are not plausible, even though they're very eloquent statements of ideas. But I don't know why CBS or the sponsor or anybody else would have expected anything less than that from Serling. Yeah. Anyway, you can tell near the end of the series, and it's not, I don't know how many episodes there are, 20, 24, something like that. You can see the shift in it as it gets away from these philosophical, almost, allegorical, existential stories into ones that have more action and where Bridges' character gets into fights or shoots people. Those are the scripts Serling didn't write. Yeah. And he himself said, I think it was on Friday night, and he'd say, there are some weeks where I just wish it would go right from Thursday to Saturday and there wasn't any Loner. So it was something that left him very discouraged, or at least disillusioned, with the prospects of working in series TV, and it wasn't going to be something that he was going to do again.
The second one is the draft of Planet of the Apes, the film that he did, and some years ago I interviewed Carol Serling, his daughter, and from what she told me, her father felt, and so does she and a lot of other people, that he never got the due credit for that script. If you ever watched the Planet of the Apes films on DVD when they do the behind the scenes things, it makes it seem as that Serling, did the second draft after I think maybe Pierre Boulle, the novelist, did his draft, and then everything was changed, and what we see on the screen was the guy who was finally credited. But a lot of things did stay. Yes, some things went, like the original book, it's set in the future on a different planet, and it's a highly technological society, and Serling went with that. But a lot of the humor, the get your stinking paws off me, you damn dirty ape, the Statue of Liberty stuff, and it seems to me just about anything that is memorable in terms of a line or an image is something that was put in by the Serling script. And Carol Serling, was of the opinion that her father didn't get the credit that he deserved for his role in that script. But he seems to have at that point, seen it, well, they paid me for it, and I'm not going to make a big stink about it.
Yeah, I think you're right. When you look at what Serling did to the story, which a lot of people felt was going to be very difficult to adapt into a movie, Serling did make certain big changes in the novel's plot. But outside of those changes, the plot actually fairly closely follows the outline of what happens in the novel, and there are certainly philosophical aspects of what's happening. Some of the speeches that characters make that are very much in tune with Serling. So I think that when you look at this script, I would agree that people generally don't give him a lot of credit for either for that or another big screen movie that he did in the same time period, which was 7 Days in May.
Mm.
That's a very good script too, and he doesn't get a lot of credit for that because he took entire sections of the script verbatim from the novel, which is a wonderful way to make sure it follows the course of the novel. And you don't get credit for that, but you should get credit for knowing when you can't improve on something, and so that's a bit of a sidetrack there. But I would agree with you that it wasn't vintage great Serling, but he deserves credit for the parts of it that work. And without Serling's participation, is Planet of the Apes a cult success? I'm not sure that it is.
Well, the opening monologue and then the final scenes are both things Serling added.
And
But
they fit him to a T.
yeah,
That whole cynical
yeah,
aspect is vintage Serling.
yeah, cynical humanism.
Charlton Heston is great in that role because he is able to deliver those lines with such conviction.
Yeah, and he because he's Charlton Heston, he was the big macho man. He can say things that a smaller, diminutive man like Sterling probably couldn't. And then we get to the final big one, which was Night Gallery. And this is sort of from what his daughter told me too, that her father sort of by this time was like, you just want me to host the show. I'll write a few episodes. I'll host it. And the thing is, you can listen to some of his college talks. He's relentlessly negative about that show.
Well, I think one thing that Serling regretted, perhaps, was that he chose to give up any creative control of the content of the show. He gave all of that over to the show's executive producer, so he didn't want that burden. And the flip side to that is that when he began to push back against the direction that the show was taking, he didn't have the authority to do it. And he could register his objections, but they didn't matter. If they were good objections, fine. But just because they came from Rod Serling, you're not. It didn't have that power. A lot of his scripts were rejected, especially by the time you get to the third season. They have this absurd section in the second season where they have these comedy blackouts that very brief,
Yeah.
but they'll take some ghoulish characters and insert them in almost a Love American style.
I was just thinking of that. It became sort of a monster of the week, monster of American style.
Yeah, and he has this great line where he says, "I don't think a show can do Edgar Allan Poe and then come back with Flip Wilson." But I think the important thing for Serling is, again, I think Serling is a little hard on himself when it comes to Night Gallery because there were some things that he wrote for that. I'm thinking of they're tearing down Tim O'Reilly's bar, which I think even Serling recognizes as one of the finest single pieces of work he ever did for television, and even above what he did for Twilight Zone. And he is justifiably proud of that. And the fact that it is a Twilight Zone kind of episode. It doesn't really fit into Night Gallery in the same way that more of these horror occult type of episodes do. But it carries that whole episode of Night Gallery. It's the shining moment of it. So I think Serling is right to be disenchanted by what Night Gallery turned out to be. He when they put it into syndication, and they added these hacked up episodes of a supernatural show that they'd had called The Sixth Sense. So they were taking shows that had run 50 minutes, and they're hacking them down to 24 to fit into an episode. But they paid Serling $100,000 to come in and do the new introductions for them. Mm-hmm. And as you said, he was, by that time, I'll take the money and go.
It seems like he was sort of TV's answer to Orson Welles.
Yeah, you know, that's a very good description of it. He's on talk shows. He's on game shows.
Hosting them.
Hosts a game show. He's on commercials. Some of the best work I think he did at this point in time was when he was doing the narration for the Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau.
And didn't he also? Yeah, that's true. And he did films like the Eric von Daniken movie Chariots of the Gods. Mm-hmm. But didn't he also appear on Lucille Ball's second show as Rod Serling?
Yes.
And they were kissing cousins from Binghamton and Jamestown, which are two cities that not too far from each other.
And you know, Serling always he'd even played himself. He played himself in an episode of Jack Benny, an episode of Dick Van Dyke, where they, the Twilo Zone. They talk about. So he had become an extremely prominent writer in pop culture. The only other writer I can think of that made a regular bit of appearing on game shows and talk shows like that. Well, there was Selma Diamond, the female comedy writer, who later did more work on TV as an actress. Yeah. But then, somebody like Mel Brooks and the cast from the Sid Caesar shows, Carl Reiner. Yeah. They did very well, but amongst those kind of big time writers, you'd never see Reginald Rose or Patty Chayefsky on What's My Line or You Don't Say or a program like that. But Serling was very good at that kind of thing, and I suppose it cheapened his image a little bit. But I think by that time he had already built up an image that was going to withstand anything else.
Well, in a lot of his college lectures that he gives, and he spent time as a teacher and a lecturer, he does talk about his two big regrets. He wanted to try to get into Hollywood films, and he had marginal success at best. But that one, he never had a play on Broadway. Yep. And also that he never wrote the novel, and he always thought it was because it was based in his own insecurity that he didn't think he could do it, so he always stayed in the safe lane of what he knew best.
Well, and he kind of talked about that with Wallace as well during that interview. He had said that he didn't really know how seriously he could take himself as a writer because he had success in TV. It was a medium he was very comfortable with, and he thought that TV had something to offer. But he says, I've never done a stage play. I've never done a big screen movie. Of original material, and I'm hoping to be able to write a novel. But I think you're quite right about that. And maybe that comes back to that Napoleonic thing we talked about at the very beginning. That he did have a certain sense of insecurity and a fear of either failure or rejection, that he would, to use his word, self-censor by not attempting it in the first place.
Yeah, I did a show recently with a fellow about Gilligan's Island, and we're talking about Sherwood Schwartz, and I was mentioning, even though it was about Gilligan's Island, I mentioned the Brady Bunch, and we were talking about why we thought that it lasted when it didn't do well in its first run, and I said, well, I think each Brady episode, especially the first 2 or 3 years, are basically modern fables. The kids get into trouble, they learn a lesson. It's almost like they were live action. I don't know if you ever saw Davy and Goliath, the claymation.
Yep. Oh, yes.
It's sort of like that. And I think my attitude towards Rod Serling is best summed up in a poem I wrote 20 or so years ago called Aesop in a Modern Box. And I look at Serling as being a moralist in the best sense of that. Yes, he could get preachy. Yes, sometimes when his characters, when he was just going rat-a-tat-tat through scripts, become just himself talking to himself, talking to himself. But in that 10 to 20% of stuff of his where he's good, it's like the little girl with the Ford. When he's good, he's very very good. But when he's bad, he's horrid. When he was in the groove, there was no one else like him, and there hasn't been since.
Right. Well, one of the reasons at the outset of the show that I had mentioned in passing my next book, looking at classic television stories that serve as prophecies for our modern era, I do about between 15 and 20 different episodes are made for TV movies. 3 of them are episodes of The Twilight Zone. And all 3 of them were written by Rod Serling. And it's because the elements that he's talking about are immensely human. When he's talking about whether it's totalitarianism or a story like The Monsters Do on Maple Street, or any of those kinds of things, he's getting to that human condition, and he's talking about issues like freedom and love and friendship and living in a neighborhood and being able to depend on people. And when you talk about being a moralist, you're cutting right to the heart of it. That Serling did as well a job, I think, as any writer in any medium for being able to talk about what it actually means to be human. And, people might think that I was being redundant in using 3 Twilight Zone stories in this book, but I'm not. Each one of them has something important to say, something specific to say, and these 3 stories say it better than almost anybody else in almost any other medium could say.
Well, I think that's about as good a summing up as you or I could give of the man. So unless you have anything else to add,
I think, for anybody who doesn't know any of the work that Rod Serling did other than The Twilight Zone, it's well worth seeking out. You can find some of it on commercial DVDs, you can find some of it on the gray market, and some of it on places like YouTube. But it's well worth it, because whether it is excellent Serling or average Serling, there's no such thing really as boring or bad Serling.
Yeah, it's and also I think they're still in publish. Some of the original Twilight Zone stories that were adapted might still be in print. So I would recommend people read them.
Some of his earlier TV plays too.
Yeah.
You can go on to the Internet Archive and find some of those, I think.
Well, we'll be back next month with another edition of American TV with Mitch Hadley, and we'll see what we have cooking up then.
Looking forward to it, Dan. Thanks again.